Hello everybody. In December I played in 93-95 old school Singleton no reserved list tournament. Singleton of course means that you can only use one copy of the card, and these are different cards because they have different names, right? And also it was 93-95 tournament. You could use cards from all the usual 93-94 sets, including Fallen Empires, but you could also use Ice Age and Homelands. Unfortunately, this is the only Ice Age card that I used in that tournament, but I am going to start uploading videos from those matches because the tournament is over soon, and you will see how cool and creative many decks were that we played. There were some decks that were only Homelands and Ice Age based, so only those cards. Always a pleasure to see. No reserved list meant a very interesting environment. Well, it's one of those tournaments for which you really have to prepare, because you need to know which cards are reserved list and which cards are not. So we definitely know that duels are reserved list, we know that power cards are reserved list, we know that some of the most highly playable, let's say, cards such as the Abyss and Mode are reserved list. That is something we know, but you should really be careful because there are some cards that you think are on the reserved list, but they are not, such as Mind Twist, for example, or Demonic Tutor. I guess Demonic everybody knows about it, but Mind Twist is not so obvious because it is actually a rare, and it was reprinted in Amon Cat, and the last edition before that was the 4th edition, so it really tricky and complicated. And on the other hand, there are some cards that are rather cheap, and perhaps you thought that they were not reserved list, but they actually are. So you really had to do your research before building a deck. But then again, this meant that there are some cards that had their chance. There are some cards that were able to shine, the cards that you don't normally see. So the mana base, we have got 22 swamps. The swamps are of course necessary. We need a lot of black mana. We need a lot of black mana for Drain Life. We need a lot of black mana for cards like Underworld Dreams. And also the purpose of swamp, as you understand, is to be pumping Nightmare. Still, I couldn't resist adding Urberg. It was not relevant in any of the matches. My opponents didn't have any first strike creatures, and we didn't use Swamp Walk, but still, always a cool card, always worth admiring. We also had Strip Mine. So one of those environments we don't really rush to sacrifice Strip Mine to deny your opponent of some mana, even though I did do that sometimes, as you will see in the videos. But also it's very good just to be used against Mishra. It's nothing really special here. There is the ubiquitous Mishra. Unfortunately, we all must use it when we are able to do so, because the card is so powerful. Unfortunately, if you cannot beat them, join them. So sadly, Mishra is an auto-include for me, in tournaments at least. And we also have got Maze of Fifth. It's a card that I often forget to use, or at least I often say to myself that I don't have enough slots for that. But it is a really good and important card. There are several games that I could even say were won by me using Maze of Fifth, or at least it kept me from losing for a long time. So now we'll go through non-creature spells, because as you can understand, these formats are very often creature based. They are heavily based on creatures. So here is my main board package. Yes, there are 15 cards in the sideboard, and it really does matter, because you understand that normally you wouldn't just board in a lot of hate. You will simply be using a lot of different cards that might be good for slightly different purposes, and this means that you have got, well, almost half of your deck, yes, that you can replace, and by that, you know, what I actually mean is that you are able to use a lot of different cards that you wouldn't normally be using, right? You cannot just board in a lot of Circle of Protections from some particular color. Yes, you really be inventive here. So anyway, Paralyze was a little bit disappointing, because I can say that normally I didn't used to like Paralyzed, but then I saw how popular it is and I decided to give it a try. And I should say that in this environment where people have a lot of mana, the games usually tend to be a bit slower, and removal is not really abundant. I should say that Paralyze is even a card that I sometimes sided out. Then we've got Mind Twist, the beautiful black bordered Mind Twist that always serves as a memory of my trip to Madrid, where I actually met Manuel, my good friend, with whom we played Magic on Skype and then were able to play in real life. So anyway, yeah, just a little story I remembered. Mind Twist is always incredibly powerful. And so is Hymn to Torak. So those two unfair cards, unfair in many ways spells. And we also have got Animate Dead. I decided to put it to my main deck, and I think that is correct. This is the right decision, because there were some situations where I could just use this card to bring back my big guys who were killed by removal, or just 2 mana. Sometimes I could even cast it on my opponent's cards, but I didn't do that. So I also like to, whoa, sorry about that. I also like to bring back such cards as Trace Killian. So this one is definitely relevant. Next, we've got Drain Life. Drain Life is the ultimate burn spell, which doesn't feel like a burn spell, but it actually is. And it does act as creature removal. Sometimes I regret not using it soon enough to get rid of my opponent's creatures, and it's just an incredibly powerful card in this environment. Demonic Tutor, no comment here, especially when you only have 1 copy of each card. It really is the card that brings you the silver bullet, and certainly a great reason to play black. Dark Ritual, however, was really, I don't know what I was thinking when I was trying to squeeze Dark Ritual into my Singleton deck. It really is a great card. You want to be able to use it early, but do you really want to have it in your deck when you have got 60 cards? So just the theory of probability will definitely show you that more likely than not you will get it mid-game or in late game, and you certainly don't want to see it then. Especially because we don't really have any cards that are similar, right? You could use something like those, 2 guys which are identical except for the name. So Sol Ring, on the other hand, was definitely something that I needed. I even ended up using Demonic Tutor a couple of times for Sol Ring, because my deck is incredibly mana hungry, not just black mana but colorless mana as well. And Bad Moon, we've got plenty of creatures, as I have said, and Bad Moon was definitely relevant. The book is one of those deciding factors in who will win the game, unfortunately, because it doesn't always seem fair. I could even say that the book feels like Library of Alexandria in proper old school 93-94. So I won some games just based on card advantage using the book, and I lost some games to people who were using it, and it's an incredibly powerful card, of course. The small book, Jalum Tome, is not so relevant, actually. Very often you just want to continue discarding your lands that you don't really need, but with this deck I can say that it's not very often that I had enough lands, so yeah, a bit underwhelming, but then again, always fine as well. Icy Manipulator. Here's our beautiful, Icy Manipulator from Unlimited, and I must say that this card absolutely rocks. You definitely know how good it is. There is some nice synergy, for instance, with the Imp, the Netling Imp that you are going to see. There is also some synergy with tapping your opponent's city of brass, even though it's not that common in the Singleton format, but still there are some situations like that. And sometimes you can just tap your opponent's high C manipulator so they don't tap yours. And finally, we have got one of my recent favorites, the card that I played in the last 3 decks that I assembled in the last several months. Incredibly powerful, just fantastic. And as you understand, in some slow games, it can bring you even much closer to victory. Next, we've got the creature package, quite large. The knights are, don't even know which one I like more, because I really do like this Order of the Ebon Hand from Ron Spencer, this, you know, heavy metal guy. I love the reflections here, and just so cool. And of course, Mark Poole, as you know, is my favorite, my very first artist that I really started to notice when I just started to appreciate magic art. I started to look at who the artists were, and yeah, Mark Poole is probably still my favorite artist. Cannot pinpoint that. Maybe it's the colors, maybe it's the manner, maybe it's the minimalistic style. I do not know what it is, but absolutely beautiful. But anyway, you know how good Pump Knights are. A ton of mana. He gets first strike, incredibly powerful, fearsome, and your opponents usually know this, so they try to kill them as soon as possible, and just for 2 mana, really a bargain. Now, here we're getting to the more interesting cards that you don't see very often. My very first time that I played Junon Ifrit, I guess that I played Junon Ifrit maybe 20 years ago, if I might say so. Well, maybe even more, maybe 22 years ago. And it was on computers, the computer game, Chandler game, Junon Ifrit. So during your upkeep, pay 2 or bury Junon Ifrit. It means that he is quite mana hungry, and that's not always great, but you know, if you drop him late game, so that's a 3/3 flying creature, that's very important. And also in this environment you don't have the bolt, and Mishras are not that abundant, so well, Mishras don't fly, so they will not be able to block him anyway, but you get the idea. So yes, again, late game you just drop him, pay 2 mana each turn, no problem usually. Does have evasion, quite a solid card. But if you drop him early game, then you will be able to swing very often to your opponent, and they will try to get rid of him, and maybe then you will have enough mana to do something else. So it did work. Of course, it can slow you down sometimes, but I really enjoyed playing this card. You know, I absolutely love all those genie and Ifriti, or whatever the plural is of those creatures. So yes, speaking of creatures that make it worse for you, creatures with some drawback, here we have got Darlor, this hilarious fish creature from Nightmare or something. And your black spells cost an additional black to cast. Now, very important that it's an additional black, so you cannot use Soul Ring, you cannot use your colorless mana, and this is quite tough, to be honest with you. I usually think of him as a weaker version of Juzam Jin. Of course, it's not the same, but 4/4, still fearsome, of course, as you understand, can kill most creatures in the format. So nice card, but did stop me sometimes. I would say it's maybe even worse than Junon Ifrit in terms of how it works, in terms of how it prevents you from developing your mana base. Hypnotic Spectre, no comment. We all know how good it is to have Hypnotic Spectre. Oubliette, another card that I had for a very long time, always wanted to use it, but here was finally the time to use it. And after playing it, I kind of understood why I didn't use it that often, why I would normally go for Terra or Drain Life or maybe some other kind of removal, especially if I'm using a multicolor deck. So oubliette, as you see, and it's really tricky because you gotta read the modern text of the oracle, and what is interesting about it is that it doesn't work as an aura, even though it looks like it, but it's not, and it's quite complicated. It does target at the same time, so protection will work, and I think that, yes, here it doesn't say that it targets the creature, but yeah, you really must read this text. Anyway, what is important is that oubliette is essentially a way, it's like an oblivion ring, if you like this, modern analogy. Card that temporarily gets rid of the creature, and the problem is that your opponent can just destroy this enchantment or can blow up the disc, so that's quite important. We saw some situations where your opponents could blow up the disc and just have the big creature that you had removed. You will see when you will be watching the gameplay videos that I'm going to upload soon. Quite interesting interaction, but at the same time it is a good way of dealing with creatures, even though temporarily. And I absolutely love the card itself, the flavor, the art. This is, I guess, the dark version. Yeah, it is, not the light one. Next we have got Black Knight, which is yeah, it's nice, but of course not as good as the Pomp Knights, especially in this deck. So 1 toughness doesn't matter, and we definitely have enough mana for the first strike and also for pump. Now, Nettling Imp is so good. Nettling Imp forces a particular creature, non-wall creature, to attack. If target creature cannot attack, it is killed at end of turn. Can be used during your opponent's turn before the attack may be used to summon creatures this turn. So basically, you force your opponent's creature to attack, and then you have got your big guy waiting for them, and destroying them one by one. Or maybe even more interestingly, you can use Icy Manipulator. Here it doesn't say that if the creature cannot attack, it is not destroyed. No. So if the creature cannot attack, it is killed at the end of turn. Quite merciless. So you tap and you use this guy and slowly kill your opponent's army. Well, of course, this is just in theory. Did not really usually work. Okay, now we had a Frozen Shade. Again, love black bordered black cards, especially the tint that you've got here. It's not everywhere that you've got this, right? So for instance, if we compare this to Arabian Nights, right? So there is certainly some difference because the frame itself is much lighter, but here the frame is very dark, and the border is also very dark, so it's just a very nice effect. Absolutely love it. I know there are some people who are making black bordered only decks, especially black bordered decks. It's just so cool. So anyway, Frozen Shade usually had enough mana for this guy. Then again, your opponent will very often find a way to play around this creature being able to be pumped. So it's not perfect, but you could make him big. So very often this could work. Urg Raiders are just very nice card. In a creature stalemate, of course, they will be killed very often because you don't want them to be just sitting on the defense and not doing anything, damaging you. And if they attack, then you really should be prepared for an all-out attack. Otherwise, your opponent will quickly shut them down. So, not really happy about this card, but there were a couple of scenarios where it was just an extra good thing. So, yeah, one more thing about the Nettling Imp. Works really well with Royal Assassin. So just no way for your opponent to save their creature. Royal Assassin is definitely a card that was so heavily, I could say, praised. It's a card that really had a lot of value. Now people know that it's just a 1/1 guy, so perhaps it's a little bit easier to get rid of him early, but still. And don't forget about the word pub. You probably saw my video where I talk about those things you may not have seen before. So I'm not sure that you have seen the pub. Now you have. Next. So yes, am I happy about Royal Assassin? Certainly yes. Good inclusion. Carry On Ends. Carry On Ends, very similar to Frozen Shade, but the good thing is that we are able to use our colorless mana. So use colorless mana, it works, it's just fine. Use your Soul Ring, good guys. Fallen Angel. Fallen Angel, I was on the fence about this, but it just ended up being a 3/3 flying creature for 5 mana, which is not terrible in this particular environment. And this ability, I could sometimes use it, but never really did. Next, we've got the heavy hitter, the absolute, winner of this creature race, Nightmare. Nightmare, I believe, was 9/9 maybe. This was the biggest Nightmare that I had, and the card is just amazing. Also, a very rare opportunity to play this card. I love this Fire Horse, and most importantly has flying, and it does seem like a bargain for 6 mana, and only one of them is black. Just such a good card. And you see, when I play tournaments like this, or maybe the dark tournament that I mentioned, which was in January, really not so long ago, but it seems that it's not so long ago, but in fact it's almost been a year now. So anyway, what I wanted to say is that when you play tournaments with such limited card pool or some restrictions, you really feel closer to the original spirit of Magic. So you are able to play Junon Ifrit, you're able to play Nightmare. It's not just those, I could say, several dozens of the most powerful cards. So this is what old school Magic is about for me personally. But of course, Sengir Vampire is very strong and auto-include for most black decks. Next, we have got some artifacts, artifact creatures in particular. So let's start with Tetravus. As you know, Tetravus is really powerful, 4/4 essentially, for 6 mana as an artifact creature. That's a fair deal, and you can also use him to get more creature tokens, right? There are some nice combos. I really have to revisit this idea with Tolnus's Coffin, and using just some boomerang style effects, and also there is Hell's Caretaker, right? So very, very good combinations. And Tetravus, yeah, your opponents really feel how good it is, yet we're often trying to fight it. Next, we had Triskelion. Well, Triskelion is even better. Triskelion essentially gives all colors some proper removal, and don't forget that you can hit essentially, if you are using this card as a finisher, that is 7 damage for 6 mana, and that is a lot, right? Swing for 4 and use the rest 3 damage from the counters. Very good, of course. And there was even a case where I would use my Animate Dad on him. So next we've got the Golem. Yes, the Golem is once again one of my guilty pleasures. I used to love this card, really appreciated it, and I understand that's a 4/6, but 6 toughness, unbeatable really. Normally don't see anyone who will be able to beat him without any extra support. So really nice blocker and attacker, a fearsome creature, really underappreciated in my opinion. Clockwork Avian was my last minute inclusion. I'm not really a fan of those Clockwork cards, and that is of course mostly because you must tap this creature during your upkeep. That's definitely not a convenient thing to do. So essentially it's 4/4, but at the same time, the more you use them, the smaller they get, and you must skip a turn essentially. I mean that this card must skip a combat in order to be restored to its initial state. Next we've got Juggernaut. Now interestingly enough, Juggernaut, of course people will usually have some answers. It will usually be not in the early game that you cast him, it will get to you a bit later, and then just act it as a pseudo removal. Very often people would trade some 3 toughness creature, let's say 3 power creature with my Juggernaut, or sometimes it served as a blocker. So yeah, normally you cannot really expect that he will be able to get through your opponent's defense. And next, finally, we have got my, I would say, newly discovered card, Dancing Scimitar, because of course I knew that this card existed. I remember how I played it again back in the day, but I very often underappreciated it, said that it's well too weak, it's not good enough, 1/5 for 4 mana, but to be honest with you, it's not such a bad thing, right? 1 point of damage, usually your opponents cannot block and kill him, they can just end up blocking him, and he will maybe get 1 point in if you have got some other big creatures that your opponents will block. So nice, and also is a good blocker, 4 mana, and the art is so nice. I can really feel the, you know, strange kind of fire here. I don't even know how to describe this. Dancing Scimitar, really nice card. Next, we've got Sideboard. So for Sideboard, first of all, we have got Terra. You know, I'm very often on the fence about those cards. There are some cards that I would like to include, some, let's say, artifact hate, or some particular cards that work against not all decks, but some decks. And I know that the usual consensus among more experienced players is that you shouldn't have any cards that will not work against the majority of decks in your main deck. This means that the downside of having a Terra and potentially meeting a deck that has no creatures or has creatures that are only black or artifact, the downside of this situation is more important than the upside of the situation where you have Terror in your main deck and you are able to destroy your opponent's creatures even before sideboarding. So I don't know about that. I just decided to follow this idea. And again, alpha look really nice. Then we have got Howl from Beyond. So yeah, there were a lot of different interesting decisions, and sadly many of those cards I just didn't use, even though I kind of regret it. So Howl of Beyond is perhaps one of those cards that I should have included. It acts as a pseudo fireball, since it just, you know, can help you to destroy your opponent's big creatures or to finish them. You know, when I had about 8-10 mana, why didn't I play this card? I often criticize myself for not doing that. Word of Binding is really nice. Sadly, no place for it again. Maybe there were some situations where I could swing for lethal, just tap all of my opponent's creatures, because you cannot believe how often you can face creature stalemate in this kind of an environment. Next, we've got Gloom. Never really got to use it. And Disrupting Scepter, same idea. Bog Wraith, can't say that I met, you know, a lot of black decks. And Cursed Land. Now, a couple of interesting things. Essentially, they're very similar. Every deck has lands. Some decks also play Zuran Orb. Now, that is important, as you will see in one of the matches, and even more than one. So I completely forgot about the existence of this card and its popularity. But anyway, speaking of Cursed Land, it gives you inevitability. In a creature stalemate situation, 1 point of damage every turn really does matter. You will see that we had very long games. We had some games that were close to an hour, just one game. So definitely this can matter. And this one is pretty much the same, but it's an enchantment that does 1 damage to your opponent for the artifact that they control. I mean, for a particular artifact. I'm thinking of an idea, and I've been testing it for a long time, but still it's so far from what I want to see that I don't really dare doing this. I'm referring to an Enchantress deck. So there are many different builds of Enchantress. I'm thinking about the evil Enchantress, meaning black and green, mostly some kinds of enchantments like these, or maybe Wanderlust on your opponent's permanents, and just some points of damage every turn. Next, Haunting Wind. Regret not using this card, because there were some cases. Just think of it, how often it can be used. Your opponent taps Icy Manipulator, your opponent taps the book, Mishra, So every time they tap something, they get a point from Haunting Wind. However, what is important is that it doesn't only work against your opponent, it also works against you. So you really have to choose when to use it. And my deck did have a lot of artifacts, but probably some decks even had more than mine. So maybe I should have used it. Anyway, next we've got Relic Barrier, tapping your opponent's artifact. Didn't really use that. My favorite, Rod of Ruin, with the accidental Chris Rush signature. Got it as a 20-cent card in a damaged state. But the signature is actually legit, as people said. So very, very nice. Sinkhole, didn't really use it. The Mineral's Disc, on the other hand, is definitely useful. Can work against your opponent's enchantments, and there are some incredibly powerful enchantments, I could say, such as Stormbind in 95. And then we have got Ashes to Ashes. That's a painful card. I was thinking about, including it into the main deck, but then I thought, no, probably not. It depends really. If your opponent plays some direct damage, such as red, then certainly not. And really, when I used it, I cannot say that I was really happy with the result, in this deck at least. However, Aladdin's Ring, remember, again, one of my videos. This is the evil, I don't know what, Jafar, evil wizard. So Aladdin's Ring looks like an impossible card to cast and use, but actually it isn't. And for 8 mana, you cast it. For 8 mana, you are also activated, but then again, you don't really have a lot of mana sinks. So I did cast it, and it did help me. So really a powerful card. So this is, as you can see, the Singleton deck. I will give the link to the tournament in case you're interested. It's not really this particular tournament that we play all the time yet. It was more of a holiday event, Singleton with some restrictions, and normally we just play old school 93-95. So in case you're interested, you can join me. And not only me, I mean, you can join the community. And I wanted to say that you should look forward to the matches that you're going to see on this channel with me using this deck and my opponents using some interesting builds of no reserve list 93-95. So that's all, and I'll see you around. Thank you for watching. Bye.